Welcome everyone to our press conference, Women Leading a Fossil Fuel Phase-Out and a Just Transition. My name is Osprey Oriel Lake, and I am the Executive Director of the Women's Earth and Climate Action Network, WECAN. And I want to begin by thanking our esteemed speakers for joining us today and their vital work and leadership. And I'm going to be introducing them in the order that they're going to speak and then make a few opening comments. We're going to be hearing from Colette Pichon Battle, Esquire, Vision and Initiatives Partner for Taproot, lawyer and climate justice activist from the U.S. Thank you for being here with us. Gina Cortés Valderrama, climate, gender, and economic justice expert from Colombia. Thank you. Dr. Ameria Sawas, head of research and policy for the Fossil Fuel Treaty Initiative from the UK. Thank you. And we do have another speaker underway, which I'm sure she'll get here by her time. Majo Andrade Cerda, member of the Council of CONFENIAE, leader of the economy and community development arena, member of the Kichwa peoples of Serena, and she is from Ecuador, and I'm sure, oh, here she is. Please join us. You have a seat here. Thank you. Around the world, frontline women and global advocates in all of their diversity are building critical strategies to end fossil fuels, which is what we're doing here. Let's not forget what we're really doing here at this COP. We are calling for justice and accountability from both financial institutions and governments, and it is far past time for investments in global economies to shift towards a just transition, one that prioritizes people and planet over profit. We are here in the heart of the Amazon, a place of immense beauty, teeming with biodiversity, while at the same time, the Earth is being pushed to violent breaking points. We are not only having a crisis of carbon emissions, it is a crisis of power, of systems, of extractivism, colonialism, capitalism, patriarchy, and a global elite consolidating wealth while communities burn, drown, or disappear. 4 wealthy countries have increased oil and gas production by 40% since the Paris Agreement. And since Paris, the world's 60 largest private banks have funneled over $7.9 trillion into the fossil fuel industry. Meanwhile, a recent emissions gap report reveals our planet is on a trajectory to surpass 3 degrees of warming. This is a death sentence for millions and a disaster for every living being. In the face of these disastrous numbers, we demand that government leaders stand up to the fossil fuel industry instead of catering to them. Communities worldwide are organizing strategic campaigns to stop fossil fuel infrastructure, demand divestment, and halt extraction at its source. At WECAN, we work from multiple angles to advance divestment and a justice-centered fossil fuel phase-out. This includes meeting face-to-face with financial institutions, exposing injustices, and calling for financial institutions and governments to stop the flow of money into fossil fuels and redirect investments toward renewable energy solutions that respect human and indigenous rights. We are circulating a new report at COP called How Local Community Power is Central to a Just Renewable Energy Shift. The report spotlights scalable global community initiatives that are advancing decentralized and democratized energy solutions. And crucially, the report warns that the energy transition must not replicate the same injustices as the fossil fuel economy, specifically as we look to transition minerals. Instead, this just transition must prioritize ecological well-being and community-owned renewable energy projects that are rooted in democratic governance and local empowerment. The report shares studies and offers recommendations and shows that we have the opportunity in this moment of a just transition, to get things right for the communities and our planet. Next, our movements are calling not only for an immediate fossil fuel phase-out, but also stopping false solutions that don't work. This includes unproven technology, carbon offset schemes, and net zero pledges that delay immediate action. We need to be unequivocal. Carbon capture, geoengineering, carbon credits, and other market-based schemes are false solutions that delay real action and perpetuate climate injustice. These loopholes allow major polluters to greenwash their image without changing their practices. At COP30, WECAN is distributing a policy analysis called The Need for Real Zero, Not Net Zero, Shifting from False Solutions to Real Solutions and a Just Transition, which details these critical issues. Yes, we need to move swiftly, but we must also move equitably with real solutions. A key component of our Real Zero policy analysis is the need for a fossil fuel treaty, which mandates a fast and fair fossil fuel phase-out, which you'll be hearing about in a little bit. And WECAN is honored to serve on the steering committee for the fossil fuel treaty, and we urge governments to endorse and get engaged in the process. No matter how many solar panels we install, if we don't stop the root cause, fossil fuels, we will not succeed. And I'm really inspired that a few months ago, Colombia announced that it will host the first international conference on the phase-out of fossil fuels in April 2026. So let's build here at COP30 for this landmark conference that will further the fossil fuel treaty. And it also must be said that to genuinely address the climate crisis, we must overhaul the global economic system that perpetuates disaster capitalism. Just transition work calls for a regenerative, rights-based economy that centers community and nature. And in this context, the last report I wanted to share today is WECAN's report on how care work can unlock a just transition for all, which demonstrates how integrating and investing in high-quality care jobs can mitigate the worst impacts of the climate crisis, build up public infrastructure, and support feminist and care economies. To be clear, we are in impossibly dire circumstances, but we can gain hope from our collective work as women, as feminists, and the recent International Court of Justice ruling on climate change, which reinforces the legal obligation of states to prevent significant environmental harm, including that caused by greenhouse gas emissions. This legal clarity supports a just transition by emphasizing human rights and equity and shifting to renewable energy systems. I believe in women's leadership in ending the era of fossil fuels and together building a just transition. As our communities are literally fighting for our lives, these are the demands we are making at COP30 and in support of the demands of the women and gender constituency. Thank you. And I hand the floor to my colleague, Colette.
Thank you. Thank you, Osprey. And my thanks to WECAN for continuing to bring women leaders of the climate movement together. I'm Colette Pichon with Taproot Earth, and I bring greetings of peace to the indigenous peoples of Amazonia, especially the Tupinamba of Belém, Brazil. I bring peaceful greetings from the traditional lands of the Choctaw Nation in Southeast Louisiana and ask for your permission to speak today. 2025 makes 20 years since the impact of Hurricane Katrina on the Gulf South, including the Bahamas and the southern region of my country. The truth is that the costs associated with the impacts of Hurricane Katrina were real. It stands still today as the most expensive disaster in my country's history. And even with the most conservative estimations, the dollars spent to recover do not begin to value the culture, the land, the cemeteries, the songs, and the oral history that we lost. Our women have been essential in our recovery. The care of communities that is often invisibilized was a necessary part of our resistance against erasure and our ability to survive yet another attempt at annihilation. We know now that the storm that hit our shores 20 years ago is connected to the fossil fuel industry that began operating heavily in the Gulf South and throughout the world about 120 years ago. The effects of Katrina were from industrial emissions released into the atmosphere some 30 years prior to the storm. We have not yet felt the worst that is to come, and our emissions continue to rise. Taking on the fossil fuel industry in the Gulf South is a tricky strategy. We know the damage to our communities. We know the cancers. We know the pollution. We know what happens with that industry near our homes. We know the damage to the global atmospheric conditions. We know the warming temperatures. We know the floods. We know the storms. But we also know that our only choice for economic stability is to choose to work in the oil and gas industry that will kill us, or to kill ourselves working in a service industry based on slave wages. We must have the courage to move ourselves from a philosophy of extraction to one of repair. We have to move from a notion of scarcity to abundance. We have to move away from an economy of scarcity to an economy based on liberation. The real solution is to consume less, especially where my country is concerned. The real solution is to stop investing in fossil fuels. We must invest instead in our health, our life, and our liberation. Climate finance is about loss and damage, and it's also about transforming our economy. Taproot Earth is pushing for a liberation economy. Climate finance must move from extraction to repair. Current systems of climate finance are rooted in exploitation, debt, and profit-making. Wealthy nations and private investors control how funds move, often through loans and green investments that perpetuate colonial power and profit from crisis. A liberation economy replaces debt with abundance. A complete shift is needed that takes us away from the loan-based, market-driven finance and instead pushes us toward grant-based and community-rooted systems. Liberation finance rejects scarcity thinking and prioritizes well-being over economic oppression, labor exploitation, and extraction of nature. Without the transformation of international finance, developing countries will remain unable to repay loans, rebuild their homes, infrastructure, and invest in the social well-being needed for climate resilience. We're here today to demand an end to the fossil fuel industry, an end to the investing in these industries that only kill our people, and an investment in a liberation economy. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Colette. I hand the floor to Gina.
Thank you so much, and good day for everyone. From the Latin American and Caribbean Women and Gender Constituency, we have embarked in a journey of recognizing among different feminist collectives and organizations in the region to challenge as well something that is very, very present in our territories and as well in our bodies, and is that repetition of the cycles of extractions that keep plundering, as I was saying, our bodies and our territories, disguised in these narratives of transitions. And we are a region that know the trauma, the pain, and the scars from the fossil fuel capitalism, which is embedded at the end of the day in a more extractive form of imperialism and racism. Latin America and Caribbean has been for a long time the supermarket, so to say, of the different raw materials that electrify the livings and the luxury of the North by not only taking and displacing our people from the territories, but also by utilizing the labor, the time, the skills, the knowledge, and the hopes as well from the people to extract all those different resources, these different minerals. And this is something that has been sustained on the logic of occupation and the logic of militarization that we are seeing nowadays in the geopolitical context, how this has been amplified and how this reproduces itself in many locations, in many geographies. And this is not only about the minerals or the fossil fuels that are being taken, but let's also think about the amounts of water that have to be used for this purpose. Let's also think about the amount of emissions that have to be taken for this, about the infrastructure, and as well about the livelihoods that are being eroded. And in this sense is that we challenge as well this nature that has been imposed in the Latin American and Caribbean continent on the basis of exports of fossil fuels, an export-based approach that is responding to an illegitimate debt, a debt that is draining our budgets to move into the pathways towards climate action and the transitions that we want to see. An illegitimate debt that is also draining feminized bodies that are responding with their care, domestic, and subsistence work to cover what the states are not able to cover due to this illegitimate debt. And to be very honest, we have not seen as well a true and a bold conversation when we talk about transition that is integrating all these perspectives, that is integrating as well all the forces that move work and that sustain life. So when we're thinking as well about phasing out of fossil fuels and thinking about the transitions, we need to think as well about which is the work that sustains life. And that is as well that work that racialized bodies, indigenous bodies, campesinas, gender not conforming people have been doing. And this is something that as the Women and Gender constituency, we have been pushing so much to bring as well the perspective of care, not just as a women's issue, not just as a matter to discuss in the private scenario. And for this end, we are as well demanding in the Just Transition Work Program negotiations the establishment of an institutional arrangement that is the Belém Action Mechanism, a mechanism that is centering the lives of workers, that is centering the lives of communities, of peoples, based on the principles of equity and common but differentiated responsibility as a way for countries, particularly for Latin America and the Caribbean, to find cooperation among the different regions, to find as well support in financial and technical means, but as well to respond precisely to those realities to which this process has been failing for more than 30 years. It is time to move to implementation, it is time to move to action, and we need to move it fastly, we need to move it urgently, because the world is not waiting for us for another empty climate talk. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Gina, and I hand the floor over to Amira.
Thank you so much. So in the context, of the conversations we're having around fossil fuel phase out, it's important to think about who is actually driving the continuation of fossil fuel exploration. The US, Canada, Australia, and Norway collectively increased their oil and gas production by nearly 40% since the Paris Agreement was adopted in 2015. So we do have to be really careful in how we reflect on the calls in these negotiations for countries across the global south to make the transition, which we believe in, of course, as a fossil fuel treaty, but we have to understand that the situation is deeply unjust. And who is making these decisions about expanding fossil fuel production? It's steeped in a history of male leadership. It's steeped in a history of a global economic system and political system led by elite men. And there is a concept I want to throw out there today, not to get too academic, but petromasculinity. So the same male leaders who are calling for drill, baby, drill are the same male leaders who are misogynist, who are marginalizing communities, and who are leaning towards authoritarian rule. So it's very important to note the connections between global systems of oppression and fossil fuels. The other issue that's really important, which is not dealt with in this space, is the issue of debt. Debt is an outcome of the unjust financial system that we're in, and it's a failure of the global north to take responsibility around climate finance, because climate disasters are exacerbating debt crises across the world. In 2023, the world's lowest income nations paid out nearly $60 billion in debt servicing, which is twice what they received in climate financing. So what we're seeing is a race to the bottom, where countries across the global north are swallowing up financing for the renewable energy transition, whilst also growing their fossil fuel production and expecting this kind of unequal exchange with the global south. So what are we saying needs to be done about this? Well, we're talking about we need a fossil fuel treaty. Why do we need a fossil fuel treaty? Because it took 30 years to get the words fossil fuels into this space. So we're way behind on a productive plan to actually look at the systems of fossil fuel production and help nations phase them out. We need a plan where there's responsibility taken between countries of the global north and the south to support each other in transitioning away from fossil fuels. And this has three elements to it. The first element is that it has to be, we have to stop new projects across the world. We don't need new projects in fossil fuels. There are some countries that need to continue in their fossil fuel exploration for a little bit of time while they support their own communities. But countries across the global north do not need fossil fuels, and so we need to stop that now. We also need a just transition. So when we talk about just transition, it's not just about what countries do internally, it's between countries. We need a global just transition that addresses the barriers that we're talking about in terms of debt, in terms of unequal access to capital. which is leading to issues like Africa, the continent with the greatest renewable energy potential, receiving less than 2% of the global finance into renewable energy. And we need a fair phase out. So fairness has to be at the center of the rules of the game that we're setting together. Now we have 17 nations who are all from the Global South who are putting forward this proposal for a fossil fuel treaty. And what we're in the process now where we don't have a text, we're developing that together. And we're developing that with the thousands of civil society organizations that we work with, the million individuals, the 3,000 academics and other stakeholders across various constituencies. And what we're doing is putting an equity analysis at the heart of this. So we've heard from the UN Secretary General we need to change course now because we've crashed through 1.5 degrees. But in this space, that's not happening. So we need breakthrough leadership, and we believe that the Fossil Fuel Treaty is breakthrough leadership because you've got countries, you've got civil society, you've got indigenous nations, you've got many stakeholders willing to have a real conversation about how you phase out fossil fuels. And one thing that I want to note, which is really important, is that most of the most justice-oriented breakthrough ideas around the transition, around addressing the climate crisis come from women leaders, but yet less than 2% of the global finance goes to global climate finance goes to organizations led by women, especially women across the global south. So there's a huge financing gap. And if we just supported these organizations, we would actually have the breakthrough outcomes that we're looking for. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amira. And now I hand the floor to my colleague, Majo. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Since I'm from the Amazon, I kind of understand what's happening in the dialogues here about just transition. And it means indigenous peoples, we are not in the center of the conversation. And it's not because people don't understand that we need to be here because we are the most affected ones and because in our lands, you are going to find the resources that are the ones to make just transition possible. However, I think it's really important to understand that indigenous peoples we don't need participation, but we need to build all the process all together. Because if you are not doing that, it means you are not doing the free, prior, and informed consent. You are not contributing to that process of our rights. And mainly, since we are women, I think it's more difficult for us, indigenous women, to be in this kind of decision-making processes because we have to do a lot of things. For a just transition process, what we need is to understand that our ancestral knowledge, indigenous knowledge, has to be in the center of the conversation. And for that, you need indigenous women. We are the keepers of the wisdom of our cultures, of everything. We are passing through our generations. But since we are in the front lines of our fights against mining, that's the main reason of just transition, we have to take care of our babies who are already unhealthy because of the contamination of all the heavy metals that are being disposed in our rivers, in our lands. So I think it's more a conversation on both levels, even 3 levels. It's not just a conversation here in these high political events, but also how we are acting nationally to make possible the implementation of certain activities, certain experiences that we, indigenous women, are leading back in our lands. But also what you are doing with indigenous peoples like me to help this process for a just transition. Maybe if I go to explain this to my community, they are not going to understand entirely what just transition means, because what we are fighting for, it's first to be alive. Can you imagine that? How can you fight when you have to keep your back, like nobody has to attack you first? So what do we need for just transition in terms of indigenous people is also the governance. We need a good governance within our territories, our lands. And that reflects that we need sovereignty, an aspect that all conversations here happening at COP, they are not understanding, or they don't want to understand and want to implement. But the main reason why I keep coming to these events is to try to change, maybe in one paragraph in Just Transition, to include us. And it's sad because in our countries, back in my community, I'm fighting against illegal miners. But I have to come here just to change a comma? But it's necessary. That's why I'm saying we have to work on all levels, and we are all responsible of this. And it's not just a matter of who is in the negotiations, but who is buying a lot of things. So for Just Transition, I'm not just talking about critical minerals or important minerals for happening this green transition. But for me, also Just Transition means you don't have to buy gold, because gold is the main reason that I'm being attacked in my community. For Just Transition, we have to keep in mind that it's every mineral, it's being, people is thinking that it's just a mineral, but for us, it's part of our lives. And it means if we want the gold underground, it has to be underground. Everything. So for real solutions, we have to do a lot of other things, mainly asking indigenous peoples what we want. Otherwise, this is not going to work. And I think I don't have more time, but I would like I would like to invite you all to reflect. This is the COP30 with most indigenous participation. But I invite you to go to the negotiations rooms, and there's no space for indigenous peoples. So think your own conclusions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Majo. And thank you to all of our speakers. I just want to close by saying, on the note that Majo brings us to, when we got here to the Amazon and talked with a lot of indigenous partners from the Amazon, we talked to the women about our current colonial patriarchal system that we're all fighting collectively. And they said, we want you to be in the Amazon because we want you to reforest your mind. We need you to reforest your mind. So we'll end on that note. Thank you very much, everybody.
Picture.